Adriaan Groenewald here. Welcome to ThinkLead. It is, of course, a global leadership ecosystem helping leaders think and lead on a whole new level. And that's why we go to experts and leaders all over the world to access their thinking, to glean from them, to learn from them about how they are thinking about life and leadership and society at the moment, especially, and helping you then lead on a whole new level. And that's ThinkLead. Today I'm going all the way to Geneva to Vic van Vuuren, who is a director at the ILO, Director of Enterprises. He's going to give us a lot of context because he travels all over the world, not at the moment, but has been. Now he travels via Zoom and Teams, no doubt. But, you know, the incredible context he brings to enterprises and to economies because of the perspective that they gain from engaging all sorts of markets and economies is incredible. And I think it's going to bring us a lot of perspective as leaders, not just in my own country, but all over the world. Vic van Vuuren, welcome all the way from Geneva.
Thank you. Good morning.
And of course, ILO, those who may not know, I mean, I'm not going to assume as the International Labour Organization, part of the UN. I mean, you've been there for a few years. Obviously, you're from South Africa. You were the leader of ILO here in Southern Africa, parts of Africa and South Africa. And then they seconded you over there, which has given you this incredible perspective. And I've had some interviews with you. I always have a different insight into the current context when I've engaged you, Vic. So just 1 second, I want us to get into the meat of things, but give us why do you have perspective? I mean, you engage emerging markets to a large degree, but that necessitates you understanding the developed markets. So just tell us why you have context and perspective, Vic, from where you sit.
The International Labour Organization is one, as you said, one of the UN agencies, and we last year turned 100 years old. So we've been around a long time. The focus of what we do is the world of work. And we look at social justice and a decent work agenda. So in the ILO, we have we're the only tripartite agency of the UN. So we have worker and employer representatives and then governments. So the focus of our work would be largely in developing economies. We learn from the developed economies and we focus on the developing and fragile states out there to assist in developing programs and products that will support the ILO's decent work agenda. Much of the work will be around the individual, which is the worker, him or herself. And the component that I manage is the enterprise, sustainable enterprises. How do we look at bringing about more sustainable enterprises because they themselves create jobs? And then how do we grow enterprises and look at elements like productivity? How do we look at improving the innovation in the world that they're operating in now to make them more effective and deal with future markets? How do we look at global supply chains from the developed economies right down to the developing economies? Because many of them are at the bottom end of the supply chain. How do we ensure that there's certain international standards that are in place in these enterprises and not just creating jobs which bring about slave labor, the poor working conditions? So it's a whole complex area that we look at from one end of the scale to the other, and it differs from one continent to the other. Africa, where South Africa is part of, has a huge issue around informal enterprises. It's by far the biggest percentage across the globe. And so the area that we would also focus on is how do you try and move informal enterprises into a more formalized situation, which is a big challenge. So that's the nature of the work we're doing. We have a global footprint and teams across all the continents. And we have, from my particular area of expertise, we have these enterprise specialists. So in South Africa, we have an office where we've got someone who's an extension of the arm of the office in Geneva looking at our interests. But what is very important to recognize is that it's not just the traditional enterprises that we look at. We're also dealing with the social and solidarity economy. What is the role and the future importance of cooperatives in the social enterprise? And there is an emerging interest in that particular area, which we are evaluating to see what their value add can be. Also, we look at the green economy. And so one of the areas that I'm responsible for is what we call green jobs. How do you look at a just transition by taking industries and companies from an unacceptable situation within the climate change to a more environmentally friendly process? So that is an area. So when we talk about the future, it's about people and planet around enterprises. That pretty much sums up what we do.
Sure, incredible perspective and context, Vic. So let's just, before we get to all those elements that leaders must and should be aware of, from where you sit at the ILO and where you engage various markets, what is the intelligence that's coming to you in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on economies and enterprises?
Well, it's absolutely devastating. You know, when it started, it was mostly in the developed world here in Europe. China came into Europe, right here where I am in Switzerland. And we saw it didn't just hit the small and the fragile companies. It hit the large companies as well. There was no split between the big guys surviving and the small guys taking a hit. It hit right across. And it brought everything to an immediate standstill, because the way that governments responded was to lock down. And when you go into lockdown, all business or most business activity comes to a grinding halt. There are those opportunities for the few that could use this as an opportunity to grow their business in the healthcare and the provision of food. So there was a niche area that saw some kind of growth and an immediate burst, but the majority of industries were negatively impacted upon. The impact in the emerging economies and the developed world was a lot slower from a COVID point of view. But because of the lockdown in Europe and China, the global supply chains came to a grinding halt. And so the economic impact in the developing world was felt before COVID even got there. And people don't realize that. Now we're seeing the wave of COVID coming into the developing world. We see in South Africa the huge numbers that are coming about every day. But now we've not only got the economic slowdown, you've also got COVID, which is causing a lockdown and a loss of jobs. So we're seeing not only enterprises closing, but millions of jobs being lost as a result of that. And what we've got to try and do from our side is to immediately move to, how do you manage the crisis? That's the first step that we advise governments. How do you look at trying to allow small business and large businesses just to survive so that they don't close down? Then you move to a reactivation phase, which is the second phase. And here in Europe, more so than elsewhere, the reactivation phase is well underway. I think in parts of the developing world, that is also the case. And then the longer term prospect of recovery. How do you assist businesses to recover and to grow? Amidst all of this, there will be opportunities. And so what we have to try and do is identify what are the future areas of growth, because it's not going to be like the old areas of perhaps fossil fuels. And now that we're looking at a green recovery, it's going to be a totally different mindset. And so what we're encouraging governments to do now is to have a look at their policies, have a look at how they can support enterprises. And for developing economies, they're going to have to turn to the large lending institutions and the investors to try and support some of their fiscal policies, because they just don't have the means to go ahead. But I was in an interesting debate yesterday, or listening to one, on the green economy. I'm chair of a board called Partnership for Action in the Green Economy, which is a 5 UN agency program of assisting governments on how to bring about a green recovery. And the head of UNEP, which is one of the UN agencies, was bringing out the figures of where trillions of dollars are now being put on the table to assist the economy to recover. And she was saying, well, where was this money before, when we still had a plight, not necessarily a COVID plight, but high unemployment in developing economies? And so it does appear that there, maybe not enough, but there is certainly enough money to invest into economies to help them grow. The governments, however, are going to have to put forward a plan that is going to be acceptable to attract and to get money back into their economy by lending or by getting investors to come back to their respective countries. And that is why it's going to be so important for developing economies to now come out with a plan, a recovery plan that makes business sense, that will attract both investment and allow them to lend from the international institutions.
Vic, from that perspective, before we go a little bit more into detail of leaders and the impact on leaders and what should they be seeing, what may they be missing, how do you think South Africa is doing in terms of the political response? Certainly we had accolades in the beginning, a lot of resistance now because we're an activistic nation. We're a nation of activists and very undisciplined in many respects. So I don't know if government's response can be entirely to blame necessarily when you look at the citizen response, but how do you think government has responded in terms of the formula you're presenting?
I think South Africa were one of the first in the developing world to go into lockdown, which is why they got all these accolades. And I think that was great. But lockdown in the developing world, you can't just continue with the lockdown forever. You've got to have an economy that's functioning. And I think they had no option but to start opening up and to allowing some economic activity. The difficulty is more the individual discipline, but also the dynamics of a developing economy are such that you've got people living in small spaces on top of each other, the logistical challenges you've got. It's just such a hard situation to deal with. You look at the United States, that is a very advanced country, and their numbers are huge. And so you look at South Africa on the one hand as a developing economy, and you look at the United States on the other hand, and you're seeing exactly the same kind of dynamics playing out. And they are in the spotlight, but you needn't look much further. You can go into Latin America, you can go into Asia, and you'll find what South Africa's been confronted with is no different to these other countries. They're all sitting with similar problems of how to deal with it. And it doesn't help to just go back into lockdown in a complete sense. But they're going to have to bring about some kind of discipline, introducing masks wherever you go into shopping malls, and to find the advice from the WHO and these international research organizations of what is best to help your economy. How do you protect your workers in the workplace? How do you prevent or how do you institute social distancing? And I think that's an education process which you learn by default. I think South Africa has just announced some tighter measures in certain areas, and it's going to be by trial and error that you go through that. But the main thing now for South Africa is to reduce the infection rate, because if that gets out of control, it's going to have a even more negative impact on your economic activity and your ability to recover.
I think just continue. You finished there, did you?
Yeah, well, I think where South Africa is I think they're addressing the right things. It's a matter of the implementation. So from a policy point of view, from a political decision point of view, I think they've done everything that has been required of them from an international perspective. But the difficulty is, how do you get people to adhere to these strict measures of social distancing? But now in a recovery phase, it's going to have to be, what can we identify as niche areas of growth? How do we help the small businesses? What is the opportunity to take advantage of a green recovery? What can we do to look at the areas of growth in the green economy? So there are opportunities, but once again, you're going to have to bring about foreign direct investment in order to assist the government in these areas of growth and recovery. And that will need a very clear plan and strategy. And I haven't looked at the actual plans of South Africa, but I do know that there's a number of discussions and certain areas that have been identified as the way forward. But I think what's catching up with them now is just the vast numbers of infections every day. That is the Achilles heel that has to be dealt with now.
We have our stimulus packages and all of that happening. Have you ever had a look at that in terms of how we stimulate the economy and keep small businesses going? And of course, there's corruption still involved, I guess, in some places. There's so many challenges. It's such a big wheel to turn.
Well, the stimulus packages are what we recommend. Looking at tax breaks, looking at credit lines, doing your best to assist small business to survive. There's many different things that countries can do, and I think South Africa has got that in place. But I come back to it. It's one thing to have the right decisions taken and the right packages in place. It's the ability to deliver from the government level to the actual recipient on the other side. Mm. The most challenging area is, how do you deal with people in the informal sector? Because you don't have much data, you don't have a system where you've got banking systems and to pay money across. And that's where your challenge of corruption comes in. Money going into the hands of people who are not distributing to the needy. But you've just got to continue with a fiscal discipline and try and eradicate that. To the extent that you eradicate that, you'll be more successful. Countries that are not able to eradicate the corruption element of it or the mismanagement of funds, those are the ones that are slower to recover, because it's not getting to those who are needy. But that's where you can start looking to areas of cooperatives and the social enterprises who are well positioned within communities. And I think governments need to take heed of that, that this is a vehicle that can be utilized because they've got a value proposition which is inculcated into their business agenda, the cooperatives and social enterprises, which is looking after the well-being of people. And they are becoming vehicles that can be used to help with this recovery process in many countries.
So Vic, before we look at that, and also green economy, I mean, I've got a friend whose alternative energy business is booming. He's closing contracts all over the world, and while most of us are closing down businesses or it's frozen, or, we're just struggling to survive. So there are those pockets of excellence and digital. There's lots of things we can focus on. I just wanted to take a few minutes on the leader of running a small, medium, even large enterprise. Vic, what more can you give them in terms of perspective? What are they missing? If they haven't seen it all by now. I mean, if you think it wasn't going to hit your business, well, then by now it is. Okay, if you think it's not going to affect you in the future, by now it is. So maybe there's nothing we can give them to say you're missing this, leaders. But would you say there's something? I mean, what's the period of this? So how long are we going to be dysfunctional, socially, economically, politically? Do you think? And from your angle, this is not a year thing. It's not a 2-year thing, not a 3-year thing. International traveling. I mean, just help leaders see the severity of this. Then we'll talk solution. I mean, there's always hope.
Well, I think it's. I used the analogy the other day of running the Comrades Marathon. This is not running a sprint. It's not running a 10-kilometer marathon. It's not running a 21-kilometer marathon, or even a standard marathon of 42 kilometers. We're running an ultra marathon here. We don't know where this is going. You have the optimists who, and we need to be optimistic that there will be a vaccination that will come out that in the next year or in the next number of months that will suddenly solve the situation. But I don't think we should plan businesses around that hope. I think what we've got to plan for is a more longer term, long haul of what we're in for, because whether we solve the COVID crisis or not, another one might be around the corner. And so what we've got to do is relook at our business models and build in the resilience and the business continuity that is required for small, medium, and large enterprises. And those factors have to be built in. So what does that mean in reality? Well, we need to look at how we position ourselves regarding markets. I think we can now, with the disruption of supply chains, opportunities exist for trading much closer to home. And I think there needs to be far more focus. In Africa, we don't know how to trade with our neighbors. And we need to start lifting the game of trading closer to home in our own country and also in the countries surrounding us. We can develop a different kind of supply chain mechanism. So once there's the kind of opportunity, looking at the markets differently to what we've been looking at in the past. And then we've got to look at the business model itself around technology. Governments need to assist small, medium, and large enterprises in investing in technology. That is going to be a new way of doing business. The simple things of digital payments to people who are working in businesses. How do you use mobile phones to make payments? Digital payments, digital training. At the moment, many companies on international platforms are offering training for free for employees. You've got to build in a lifelong skills pattern for all your employees, no matter how small you are, because the markets are changing so quickly that your skill set has to be able to adapt to new markets. And what we found in Asia was a phenomenal amount of people, for example, in Vietnam, immediately put their guys onto training of how to trade on the platform economy rather than trading the way they were. The one company was selling music instruments, and suddenly they set up a video of how to sell via Amazon all their products, which they'd never done before, showing how they cleaned them using sanitized processes so that when you got your product, you weren't getting a product that was possibly contaminated, satisfying the end user of the quality and cleanliness of their products. They hit a whole new niche market. And instead of losing business from the COVID, they've actually increased their business activity. So it's going to be different things to different people, but innovation has got to be there. Productivity enhancement using a new digitized process or the mechanistic approach towards your business. Yes, it's going to cause some people to lose jobs, but on the other hand, you can grow your business and create employment in areas that haven't been there before. So a new business model is what has got to be approached, looking at markets, global supply chains, and digitization all in one basket. You cannot just turn a blind eye and hope this is going to go away, because it isn't.
I mean, on the one hand, something in me says when there's necessity, the innovation can kick in, and creativity, because you just have to, But on the other hand, when people are under huge stress and in survival mode, how innovative and creative can you be? So I guess some fight and some flight, some get innovative out of necessity, and some just freeze up and just die. It's that kind of time that we live in. And I don't want to speak for everyone, but on my side, I've seen a lot of innovation. I've seen people, they just had to adapt. So that's very positive, but surely there's a side where it's not that easy when we live in a world where this pressure is coming down on the individual like never before. Financial, emotional, spiritual, physical health pressure coming down on the individual, and how we have to adopt personal accountability like never before. I don't know. Any comment on that?
Well, there's 2 points I'd like to raise here. The one is we always make the mistake, particularly in Africa, of looking at entrepreneurship of those people selling sweets on the side of the road and saying, look, there's an entrepreneur. That's an entrepreneur of necessity. That's the survival mode that you're talking about, that people are being thrown into now because they don't have an alternate option. They just need to survive from one day to the next. But what we're looking for is an entrepreneur of opportunity. And so governments and the employers out there will have to develop those persons who are entrepreneurs of opportunity. They will be able to grow the economy and identify those niche areas in the care economy, health provision. I mean, in South Africa, there's a company, I forget the name, but the other day we were looking at examples of this kind of innovative process that had changed their production process to manufacturing ventilators of a very simplistic nature. And their whole business has changed now to manufacturing ventilators and healthcare products, which they never did before. But the demand for that kind of product has gone up exponentially. And so people have to be attuned to where are those growth areas. Now, these entrepreneurs of opportunity will create jobs, and they'll be able to pull in those that are unemployed. At the moment, we don't have enough scale to pull in the amount of people who have lost jobs to those that are able to find opportunities. But that's where the focus has to be in the future. And at the moment, yes, there will be the areas of necessity, but we need to find those niche areas. And yes, we're going to have to look at the short-term measures that will give people employment, like employment-intensive programs. You're going to have to go into how do you build your infrastructure? How do you maintain or increase your infrastructure? And therefore looking at these labor-intensive programs where you employ a lot of people, maybe at the minimum wage level, because we don't want to propagate bad labor practices where you're looking at cheap labor and slave labor kind of opportunities. But where you bring in labor-intensive short-term products while you're developing your other areas of your markets will have to be part of the equation, particularly in developing economies, because you don't have the ability to create millions of jobs overnight. Even before COVID, South Africa had a huge unemployment problem. No, but I just think there's so many opportunities in South Africa that we're just not tapping into. A very simple one, which I've been arguing for years, look at the lottery system. When I was living in Cape Town, we created a small business, my wife and I, in Melkbosstrand. We called it a kiosk. And we took a domestic worker and gave her some skills to run a kiosk, which sold electricity and the lottery tickets. And she was able to upgrade her income from being a very minimum wage worker to someone who was earning something to provide for her and her family. What happened was they took the licenses of all these products and gave it to the big retail agents in the shopping malls. So what happened to the little business we had to close it down. I think there are so many more examples of opportunities that if we take those licenses and say, right, let's find the unemployed graduates or people with basic literacy, financial literacy skills, and let them run these kiosks and start up, you can create 60,000 jobs overnight, if not more. But I think that's the kind of creativity and innovation that's on our doorstep that we're just not tapping into. And I think it's possible to do that even during COVID, because there will be other opportunities that come out. the distribution of goods and logistics, the delivery services, food delivery services, where restaurants are not able to cater for people as they did in the past. Here in Europe and in the UK, those kind of services have picked up drastically and able to employ people that have lost jobs because of COVID in other areas.
Vic, yeah, it's a tough one because COVID comes to us on the back of the worst 10 years in the existence of our country, perhaps. Maybe, last few years have been, in the last year or two, recessionary, and before that, huge corruption and bad political leadership. And I can go on and on about when it's hit us. So because we come from such a bad space, it's very difficult to get out of survival mode so that we can have a government who, as proactive leaders, authentic leaders, come with very innovative ways of stimulating existing digital platforms and products and ideas that can suddenly escalate globally if they had the support, the technological support and training and funding and that sort of thing. I guess everything you're talking about. But what I'm saying is, it's not a good space from which we come. COVID is hitting us and has hit us off the back of a really, really difficult period.
It comes, I think, my experience as a South African has been that we've had pockets of excellence. We've come through difficult times, from apartheid to post-apartheid, and we were able to normalize what was a very unjust society to a large extent. I don't think that we've succeeded in all areas because there's still lots of poverty and inequality. But when one looks at the policy levels and we benchmark the South African policies and laws, they match up to the best in the world. But where we fall down is our inability to take these very world-class policies and implement them. We keep falling down on implementation. Now, whether that's a leadership or a educational or maybe a combination of it, I don't think our skill set is up to speed with what we require. I don't think we're generating the right kind of skills out of the schooling systems that are able to meet on a scalability level the future market needs. When I was across and I referred to Vietnam before, and I went into Vietnam, the innovative centers and the youth and what they're doing there, it's mind-boggling to see what they're doing and how they're investing in a different type of skill set compared to everywhere else in the world. And they're ahead of the game. These Asian countries are just ahead of the game because they've invested in an education system that is preparing people for future markets. So when these youth hit the markets, they're already generating new ideas, and most of them are going into areas of entrepreneurship and self-employment and not looking to others to employ them. Now, in the South African context, as I said, we've got these really good laws and policies, but taking it to actual fruition and reducing unemployment has been extremely difficult. I don't know, it's difficult to put a finger on exactly what it is. One can talk about corruption. Maybe the leadership levels are not as deep as one would require. But for me, the real stumbling block is we don't act as Team South Africa. We tend to shoot each other down, whether it is a worker-employer relationship or whether it's government and the social partners, or whether it's just in civil society when you're going to communities. I keep finding in the areas that I've been exposed to so much conflict of individuals and groupings one against the other at all different levels. And until we can get to become a Team South Africa, is with what these other countries are doing, we're not going to be able to really deal with these underlying issues of creating employment and increasing productivity at the levels that we want to. And so it's for me, it's beyond, it's a psyche across our communities. It's about going into the homes and getting people to generate a value system of Ubuntu that we hear about so often in our culture, which isn't happening. And so it's not just a simple economic decision. It's an equation that goes to the very heart of our culture and well-being. And I think if we can address that, and that's where we need to bring in, and there was an instance where we had religious leaders coming in, where we need to involve everybody in this discussion. We need a social impact that goes from business to workers to communities and with government, and to support our government and their leaders. Not accepting the bad elements at all levels. That's what we need to get rid of. But yes, I sound like a preacher now, but it's something that I find in successful countries. When I go to the Scandinavian countries, that's what I find. It's a psyche that goes, I mean, you talk about transparency. When you're in Sweden, I found out that a journalist can go in and check anybody's bank account to see whether they pay their tax or not. There's transparency beyond the norm there. But they live and die by that kind of code of ethics. And then one doesn't have to start imagining, why are the Scandinavian countries and the Germanys of the world, why are they so successful? They've entrenched these principles from top to bottom in their society, and their levels of inequality are very small. We still have too many haves and have-nots in South Africa. And until we can reduce that social deficit, we're going to have that continual conflict around that area as well.
Vic, as we start wrapping up and maybe just end with a few solutions, I also wanted you to touch on the green side. I mean, there's a lack of trust, and not just in South Africa, between politicians and citizens, between the haves and the have-nots, between black and white. We're seeing it in America. We're seeing, again, a lack of trust in politicians and between black and white, and races and classes. And there's such a huge lack of trust. There's a trust deficit. And it's very difficult to work together. Of course, when there's trust, then either opportunity, great opportunity like a World Cup coming to your country, or a great crisis can bring unity, can actually unite you. But when there's not that binding factor of trust, it just doesn't last long. We had Cyril Ramaphosa kick off the whole lockdown with a great trust, and people felt good about the way he handled it. But very quickly we could see that there wasn't a trust across the board of politicians in general, because the moment the other politicians took over from him, the trust deficit showed. So we've got that challenge, not just in our country, but I think all over the world. And maybe in some Scandinavian countries, as you say, there's less of that because there's less divide, there's less discrepancies between classes and so on, race and so on. So anyway, we've got a long way to go, and we're expecting these political leaders of ours to do amazing things when they haven't been doing it for a long time, and we're all expecting a great deal. Let's just give us some hope. So if I'm running ordinary businesses, I mean, where are my opportunities? You mentioned cooperatives, you mentioned green. I guess we can't all grab those opportunities as small businesses and large businesses, but I love it when you give examples of people grabbing opportunities and being innovative all over the world, in different parts of the world. Maybe just end off with some optimistic feelings and thoughts and examples. Anything that comes to mind, Vic?
Look, the healthcare industry is certainly going to be an area for the future. We need to take care of each other, not only just general healthcare as in hospitals and nursing, but the well-being of people, both from a spiritual and psychological point of view, down to the physical well-being. I think people are going to pay a lot more attention to that. And so now there's opportunities. There's online. I mean, just simple things like my wife, who does yoga, went online and subscribed to a yoga class of a South African operating out of the Netherlands, doing township jazz. I mean, a very entrepreneurial. He's suddenly gone from doing little classes in the Netherlands where he's selling the African culture and theme of township jazz. He's now got a global audience who pay online to run his classes. His business has just taken off. Where he was doing these ones-off dance classes in a little town in the Netherlands, he's now become a global player. It's that kind of opportunity. People love to know about Africa. They love Africa. They love the spirit of Africa. Now we can take that opportunity. South Africans need to grasp that kind of opportunity and saying, let's grasp the digital platform. Let's use it to our advantage. We've got the exchange rate in our favor. Let's see what we can use to not only capture markets locally for more hands-on or materialistic stuff, but let's also use the global platform to go and sell our products elsewhere. And I think there's opportunities. What those products are, we need to start exploring. What does the market want? I mean, I would think 3D tourism now. How do you take someone into a township tour before when the tourists came to Cape Town, they got onto a little minibus taxi and off they go in to see how South Africans live in certain parts of that. Can't we allow those people who are suffering in that tourism industry to help them develop a product they can put onto an internet platform, and then to sell, taking people on a virtual tour into a home in South Africa. It's possible. I've seen with some of the equipment that's available. We say it's too expensive. Well, if what we did for people that we normally train and bring to Europe, the cost of an aeroplane ticket, one aeroplane ticket we can invest into some equipment of a technical nature to assist a small business. So there's many ways of offsetting that and seeing how can we invest, because travelers come to a standstill. Somebody's saving money by not traveling. Yes, the tourism guys have been hit. Let's use that ability to reinvest it. So those would be the kinds of examples that we're looking at. I think in Europe, you're finding different kinds of businesses now starting to mushroom. Yeah, in Geneva, people are using the platform to sell products and to reach their markets, which they weren't able to do when we went into lockdown. That's the kind of thinking we've got to inculcate into all of the people who are both at the bottom end of the scale and to big business who are also suffering.
Vic van Vuuren, Director at ILO, all the way from Geneva. Thank you for the context and the perspective. Also the fact that you're South African, but you're very international now. You've gone out. You were very involved in South Africa for many decades now in being part of the solution, creating BUSA, negotiations. I mean, you were at the top of your game. Then you went to Geneva for the last few years, and that's given you a lot of perspective. And that's why I like tapping into you, because it comes back to us. And your perspective, you can't help but give us, I don't know, coloring the South African context with your perspective of the globe. And we really appreciate that. And keep up the good work. I look forward to staying in touch and learning from you. Thank you so much for joining us on ThinkLead.
Thank you.
Folks, that's ThinkLead. It's a global leadership ecosystem, helping leaders think and lead on a whole new level. And I'm sure that this conversation has certainly stimulated your thinking, and hopefully it helps you lead as you ought to. And thank you for joining us again. All the best.